There is no end to writing books, and too much study will wear you out. And neither is there any end to discussions about our cultural heritage. And there is very little agreement about its true nature and meaning. For this reason, I have begun with a quote from the book of Ecclesiastes and an image of heavenly harmony, which can remind us of the virtues of simplicity and clarity during our two-day journey here in Riga. The organizers of this gathering have implored me to explore the process itself of making things accessible and how this process transforms instinctive consciousness, and to investigate how technology has played a role in these processes. And also to assess the importance of regionality in all these discussions. In other words, I have a rather abstract task. Therefore, I shall begin with three very concrete images. One of space, and please notice what the Baltic Sea region includes in this map, historically. The second of space, ideologically understood. And thirdly, space in terms of typography, and here a greeting from the National Library of Sweden. Cultural heritage seems to enthrall and engage us to no end. The more we extol globality and intercultural communication, the more we seem to be mired in questions of heritage, terms that, curiously enough, seem to exude antithesis more than congruity, but which unequivocally reveal our deep, deep, deep uneasiness, even discomfort with the notion of tradition, and our deep-rooted fascination with the drama of memory. This is nothing new. By appending the modifier digital, we have not in any way altered this discussion. And we always are projecting the feeling that we are on the cusp of greater things and new beginnings. But be it as it may, this instinctive consciousness, which I call heritage, seems to display some very clear and basic markers. We take possession of it, we safeguard it, with all due respect to the plethora of digitization projects launched on an almost daily basis. We pass it on most effectively, not with the help of new platforms and new technologies, but first and foremost, through conversation. As Sherry Turkle, one of the foremost contemporary authorities on the social aspects of science and technology, has postulated, our greatest challenge may not be navigating new technical innovations and providing access to a yet more comprehensive materiality, but rather reaffirming the power of talk and reclaiming conversation. Cultural heritage seems to be inextricably bound to conversation, which facilitates a knowledge-based, secured primarily by the participants' ability to detect emotional and behavioral patterns. It is here that the key to the perseverance and long-lastingness of cultural heritage seems to lie. To put it succinctly, cultural heritage wilts when it sheds its emotional states that most poignantly are expressed in facial expressions. This, of course, provides completely new notions of the term getting into someone's face, or even FaceTime, new dimensions and new meanings. Secondly, this does not mean that we should trivialize the close connection between technology and heritage, and not only in the digital age, but even historically. In almost every generation, technology has cut off children from adults. As the clinical psychologist Peter Fonagy has observed, paradigm shifts brought on by technology have a tendency to disrupt crucial learning relationships. such as cross-generation face-to-face contact. One need only to look around to realize that the socializing agent for a young person today most frequently is another young person, maybe not the circumstance for which our brains were designed. The digital is not the problem in our heritage discussion, but rather what the digital pushes out. Heritage is suddenly more problematic when its processional aspect is personalized to such a degree that it becomes isolated and loses, thus, its sustainability. Thirdly, this compels us to direct our attention to yet another tension to open the question of the curious relationship between cultural heritage and solitude, or solitariness, a term not to be confused with isolation. The first grounded in an inner yearning, the latter in some ways forced from the outside. As it turns out, solitude enriches and enables our conversations. Only when we are alone with our thoughts, not reacting to external stimuli, do we engage that part of the brain's infrastructure devoted to building up a sense of our stable autobiographical self. It is this reconfiguring of our autobiographical self at times of great and sudden technical innovation that shall be at the core of my short talk today. It must, however, be recognized that the region which is the focus of our interest today has for centuries been steeped in orality. Issues of cultural heritage have not always been steered by technologies of literacy, but rather by direct physical engagement and contact. This has meant that heritage has always been open to adjustment and reinterpretation, while at the same time characterized by participation and interactivity. As long as oral communication channels were open and accessible, individual and group identities intermeshed and intertwined, making it a rather difficult task for national libraries to define their terms. Oscillating between innovation and habituation, between novelty and stability, in themselves inherently repetitive, orality has built-in means of selection which gain strength from the tension between radicalism and conservatism. Orality encouraged expanding the limits of the allowed, yet clearly tempers excesses. Not challenged by set canons, oral cultures are difficult to rein in even with strict censorship. Very important for this region. Trying to define cultural heritage steeped in orality is an elusive task since this heritage, per definition, is in a constant state of flux. With its imperviousness is both its strength and its most notable shortcoming. Without a central authority, consensus can be reached across multiple nodes and can flourish unaffected by material and technical change. And rules of participation are more important than set agendas. Only once technologies of literacy gain the upper hand do we strive to isolate samples and view them under a microscope. Technical paradigm shifts serve as catalysts for the creation of authoritative heritage discourses. As soon as these discourses are codified, the mechanisms of orality are marginalized, creating what we can regard as secondary orality, and orality with an element of self-consciousness based on writing and print, with an emphasis not primarily on transmission, but rather on the inheritance itself. Content gains the upper hand, and let us be very clear about it, that we are really, really stuck in content discussions most of the time. The process itself gets depreciated. Heritage, steered by technologies of literacy, has trouble with the notion of the living, of the contemporaneous, of existing in the present moment, or even of the term currently in use. In the Baltic Sea region, this tension between cultures of literacy and orality is especially pronounced due to a geography which begets a special aesthesis or perception of the external world by the senses. There are not many places in the world where technologies of literacy have engaged as directly and orality shaped by its location, and that is approximately 60 degrees north. If we look at the globe, we'll see that this is a very unusual region for this reason. With its radical shifts and metamorphoses, with its sights, sounds, tastes, and smells. And that is what we're experiencing in Riga just now as the lilacs are blooming. And that is the ultimate Thule, the furthest north that we see. This is what we are, really. Technologies of literacy have created deep tension. The tension simply does not go away. All attempts to marginalize orality meet up not only with resistance, but also seem to give rise to modern, innovative cultures of communication which utilize communicative patterns which are fundamentally oral. There is a deep-rooted awareness of this. Using technologies of literacy does not automatically involve reneging on oral practice. Gaming, for instance, is a very oral practice, really. It's more a way of life, it's more of an activity, and it's more a networking grounded in immediacy and interchange than a game premiering an inculcated way of thought. But our topic today begs a more varied approach, one that consciously reconfigures geography, our notions of regions, and alters parameters and introduces variability. I shall be following a chronological flow, but by no means postulating a clear progression. I shall pursue unexpected insights at the expense of cohesive narratives. My first musing shall be weighed down by lead type. Few innovations have transformed the cultural heritage of this region as the way lead has. The usual narrative has revolved around production and the transforming agency of movable types, all resulting in an overabundance of information. For our purposes here today, however, this technical innovation left its clearest footnote in a completely different way. Uncontrolled, lead creates anxiety and burnout. We could just say, replace lead with digital. Burnout. It did, however, lead, however, cast light upon some very important issues. First, type provided a new platform for the phenomenon of discarding, and that is one of our major tasks in heritage discussions, is discussing how to throw things out. In oral cultures, this takes place almost unbeknownst to us, as it is an integral part of oral communication. With print, or in the digital environment, discarding is transformed to a physical activity. Secondly, it underscores the importance of brevity. We are wont to associate print and digital with volume. As an agent of change, however, print has been most effective when it is used in concentrated form and in short, I would say almost Twitter messages. Here we have a 16th century collection of Twitter messages. And also in the modern forerunner, which is, of course, is the broadsheet, is the, we'd say, the message that I sent this morning on my WhatsApp, in my WhatsApp account. The effect of this innovation, of course, has been profound, most importantly in creating new audiences. Brevity creates new audiences, just ask Donald Trump. These audiences are most often encountered on the street or in the digital version on the web. Only seldom does this take place on traditional platforms. And most frequently, it takes place in small bits and pieces. Cultural heritage, more often than not, is recognized rather than read and meditated. Recognized rather than read and meditated. My second musing shall revolve around the binary opposites, expanding borders and compartmentalizations. In oral cultures, every encounter with another person involves transgressing existing limits and celebrates the transformation of one's autobiographical self. Technically, this has taken place in a multitude of ways, even in travel. In heritage terms, this has usually been always accompanied by the discovery of the local. Every generation discovers the local as if it were a new promised land. For the architect of the local who used this region as his laboratory, Johann Gottfried Herder, this led to the realization that any sort of enlightenment, a term which we primarily use of mindful expansion and a glorification of the individual, was closely associated with Geist, and sometimes even with Geld. Herder assigned this seemingly borderless term very strict borders and limits. For Herder, technical innovation and progress were closely associated with compartmentalization, not radically different from the one our lead-induced one. This is what Heimat is all about. We are living in a period of the glorification of the local. We have suddenly rediscovered locally produced vegetables and locally produced ideas. My third musing shall revolve around individuation, on the dynamics of copying and its importance for cultural heritage, copying. I shall open once again the question of originality and uniqueness. Oral interchange is completely dependent on the notion of copying. Just as a small child learns his or herself by reenacting, that is, copying, we realize that copying most frequently lessens the value of the original. This region has basically been formed by copying manuscripts from very far away, that is Iceland, the oldest written tradition in this whole region. It is this copying which has created the culture of innovation which we associate with this region. Remember that continental culture has always been copied. We know that this Icelandic was copied. Everything is in duplication. The value is in the duplication and really not in the object itself. And this brings me to the difficult yet central tension between the speedy and the seemingly light, and that what is weighed down by physicality and materiality, our fourth musing. We most often associate technical innovation with speed, and rightly so. The one word which best illustrates modern transformations almost inevitably revert to a discussion about faster. And we all seem to be, in one way or another, seduced by faster. If we look closer, however, this faster helps us reproduce and to spread, but it seldom helps us understand and deal with more important challenges. I need not remind anyone that technical advances have also made us more vulnerable and more susceptible to manipulation. Technical advances viewed historically have most frequently led to reverting to older technologies to safeguard our autobiographical instinctive consciousness. Interestingly enough, this has been supported by recent neurological research, which has demonstrated how those in the digital age opting to use handwriting as a way of knowing often activate completely different parts of brains as those who do not. This should be something that we think about when we provide kindergartners iPads. It is no mere coincidence that some of the most innovative and effective movements in this region have used handwriting for a purpose. We would never have a visual image of this region as it was created by Caspar David Friedrich if we didn't know that he created this image literally by devoting himself to handwriting exercises, which have survived here. Parallel to this, we can observe a clear tendency to what I refer to museumization, objectifying this autobiographical instinctive consciousness. Previously, I posited a major chasm or divide in this region between its eastern and western territories in the divergent notions of literacy and orality, but only recently I have become aware how this extends even to the engagement with physicality and materiality. The fascination of the western shore of this region is very well documented. One's biographical, autobiographical self to this very day on the western shores of the Baltic Sea is directly and unequivocally associated with objects. To understand others, it is necessary to download objects, their physicality and their materiality. As example, this object here will allow us to understand the Syrian conflict 2019 taking place before our eyes. You are what you physically can hold in your hand. And this leads me to my final musing, the groundswell of the photomechanical Instagram revolution at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. The ability to reproduce and spread image in its first stage led to a proliferation of selfies, of hard disks loaded with images documenting one's life in detail. But very soon, this photographical mirror outserved its purpose. An extra image did not deepen one's understanding of oneself in this world. And we can, of course, ask the question, when will we, our generation, come to this brilliant conclusion? In its stead, what happened after this Instagram revolution 120 years ago, there arose a notion that heritage, one's autobiographical consciousness, could be best construed not through embellishment of detail, but rather by embracing emptiness, by renouncing individuation and particularity. And thus, in conclusion, I would say that we have seen today there are three ways of engaging heritage. We can do it historically, both orally and with the help of literal techniques, and this is the way we do it most frequently in memory institutions. Still today, we are historical in our approach. We can do it deliberately, which for our purposes today, I have depicted as a strategy involving reverting to older techniques to add a more pronounced element of deliberation. Only by taking possession, once again, of older techniques can we stimulate neurological processes which will allow us to deliberate at a deeper and more profound level. And finally, we finished off with where basically, we could say, we landed where everyone lands today, at IKEA. IKEA, which is symbolic of a poetic approach which really celebrates emptiness. Let us remember that Scandinavian design is a glorification of emptiness. And the most incredible thing about it all is that emptiness sells extremely well. I just heard this yesterday, but I cannot not mention this, that the newly opened IKEA store in Riga has a hard time keeping its shelves stocked because everyone seems to want to take part of Scandinavian, or we would say Baltic Sea region, emptiness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jānis. It was brilliant and truly, truly, truly stimulating. As I promised, the floor is yours now for comments or questions. Any questions? Anybody who would like to comment on something or add or ask, to take the possibility to ask something to Jānis? No, you'll go back. You can go back sitting on your seat. But any comment or anything? If nobody asks, I did have a question, because I did like one of the points you mentioned. So What do you think digital has pushed out? When really you have to name things. I think you didn't name any example, but what would that be?
Conversation. Physical engagement. First thing you notice when you enter public space is people, instead of looking at one another and their facial expressions, doing that through the phone, through platforms, intermediary platforms. In other words, it's not a question of me too touching someone. We're not even emotionally touching anyone anymore. And I'm pretty sure that artificial intelligence will probably come up with some sort of artificial emotionality. But let's see what happens. We're in the midst of it. My experience working in the laboratories in Stockholm have shown that every single major technical paradigm shift usually requires about 35 years of contemplation before it can be downloaded. That was true in the 16th century, that was true in the 19th century, that's true in the 20th century. It appears to be true now, because as long as you can sell a telephone with the advertisement that it has a larger memory, then we understand that we haven't really understood what this technical innovation has for purpose. Increasing memory is boring. In the end result, it's what are you going to do with all those digital images that you have in your hard disk? You're really not interested in them. Maybe 10 of them. And those 10 should be on you all the time. But you don't need 27,000 pictures of me standing on the bridge at sunrise.
Thank you very much. I think you deserve applause. I think it was really, really good.